Yeah, it's great to be here. Great to be invited. Thank you to Robin and to Lorenzo Piccoli for the invitation to be part of the latest in the activities of the NCCR on the Move project at the University of Neuchâtel. I'm very pleased to be part of the board of this project, and I think it's a project, ongoing project and framework of research that's having really important impact in helping graduate students generally in Europe and internationally to be part of a broader cohort. And I hope that, as well as associates of On the Move, you also have others here from other places that have been able to join this open session. I think it's one of the key aspects of professionalization, obviously, is to be able to discuss what you're doing with your own cohort of researchers, and I think this is an important part of what we're doing here today. I was also just very pleased because it's a great moment to try to bring together both friends and colleagues who are involved in some of the major journals in our field, but also give us a chance to reflect a bit on the evolution of the field of migration and mobilities. The On the Move project is a project very much about the nexus or intersection of migration and mobilities research, and I for one think this is the most exciting area in our field in some ways. We wanted to bring together a representative set of speakers that would be able to speak to this particular kind of nexus and creative overlap and crossover between the fields. And that's kind of part of the logic of the discussion. Now, in terms of, it's a difficult diplomatic issue about sort of ordering this, and there's nothing implied by the ordering other than it was my fault that we've kind of settled upon the order that we have. So, and that's because I thought it might be helpful, as well as kind of getting the views of all of the journals, to also kind of get this slightly in a historical way. That is, we're kind of asking the editors of the more old established journals to present first, and then to kind of give us the input from the newer journals that maybe have got new visions and have ideas about changing the configuration of the field and so on. So I thought that would be interesting. So the order we're going to go in is Paul Statham, first of all, from the University of Sussex, who's the editor of Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. I am, not entirely neutral here, because I'm also involved in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies as an associate editor, and was involved in it all the way back to when it used to be called New Community in the 1990s. Paul has been at the helm now. He'll tell us how long, but has seen GEMS really not only become a much bigger journal in terms of quantity of papers, but also it's publishing a huge number of important and cited sort of works. So it's a key go-to journal, as we all know. I was then very, very happy that we could get Mimi Scheller to kind of offer us a counterpoint to the GEMS point of view from the journal Mobilities. She's a professor of is it anthropology, Mimi?
Sociology.
It is sociology. I apologize. At Drexel University in Philadelphia, but is a co-founder of the Mobilities Journal, which of course is associated with the Lancaster School, and she is connected with Lancaster University. Mobilities has kind of, as a field, has developed in parallel to migration studies in a sense over the years. So it will be interesting to get that kind of counterpoint. And then we'll move to our other two journals. I think, did we say Peter was next? I'm not sure if we'd agreed on the third and fourth, or if it matters. Peter Scholten from Erasmus University, who's the editor of Comparative Migration Studies, which is also linked to a lot of very important publishing going on in the orbit of EMISCO, as we all know, and will give us a view on how that journal is established and how it is impacting the field as an open access journal, I believe. And And then Saskia Bonjour, who's a political scientist at the University of Amsterdam, will present her work as editor of Migration Politics, which again, I think another important journal that's offering a new dimension to the field. And I'm sure, as all of the editors, I'm sure you all have very particular agendas and visions about where the field is headed and where your journal fits in, and how how you'd like to encourage submissions and so on. And I guess we don't know much about our audience today, but so it'd be nice to get as many people as possible to get involved in the discussion with your questions. You can have pointed questions towards the editors. I mean, I may go light on the questions if it looks like people want to ask questions after the interventions straight away. We should just get into that, I think. But it would be good to get very direct and pointed questions in terms of advice, but also in terms of what your reactions are to what the editors say about the field, their visions, and how it relates to your work as researchers. And we'll hopefully have a very lively discussion and all learn something from this. So thanks very much, and I'll hand over to Paul.
Thanks a lot, Adrian, and hi everybody. It's nice sometimes to come out of the silo of editing a journal, which is a very lonely and solitary process that takes place many hours on Scholar One, and yeah, pleases some people and it doesn't please other people. So it's nice also to have the opportunity to talk to the next generation and also to get some feedback on what you think we should be doing and how we could do things better, which I think is important because journals are part of the landscape and part of being an academic community, and I think most of the journals we're talking about here are seen as central parts of the academic community and are run by the academic community to be so. Okay, so GEMS, is that the right way around? Maybe not. I was asked then to present GEMS as being, if you like, the one of the traditional migration journals. It's now 47 years old, and it was initially came under the label of New Community and was basically a vehicle for rather internal debates about British race relations. Then when Sussex became involved, way before I was involved in it, it had a reformulation as the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies and was one of the first journals to start looking at European comparative work and was part of the emergence, as my career or Adrian's career, of the people who started to look at migration across Europe. I've been going for, I think, 8 or 9 years as the editor. Taylor and Francis bought the journal. It was previously personally owned by a guy called Malcolm Cross, who was a lovable rogue and a little bit of a second-hand car salesman, but also a very good businessman, which was important for keeping the journal going. Anyway, when I took over, it coincided with Taylor and Francis taking over and reducing the amount of money that we received for doing the work in true institutional way. But since then, the last 8 to 9 years, what we've tried to do with GEMS is to go more global, and so initially this meant more coverage of North America, and since then we've actually put a lot of work into trying to get authors and publications from the global south as well as China in recent years. And so the idea now is that is to have a broad church, if you like. So in a sense, the whole ethos is GEMS is that it does, if you like, the heavy lifting in the migration field. It publishes tons, and it's basically a very broad church, and that's intentionally so. The ethos is to be inclusive of all topics, from all disciplines, from all regions of the world, that in their own special way speak to some kind of topic from migration and ethnic relations. The idea is that it's a key forum, a platform for the debates that are moving forward within these different fields, and importantly, the intersections between them, which is quite often where the interesting stuff happens. Yeah, so the other thing to talk about with GEMS, though, is that if you like, our only criteria, therefore, is in a sense quality as viewed by peer review. So we don't, basically, if you like, we have a kind of evolutionary approach to what should be considered good migration research, or what should be good ethnic relations research, or what should be considered the way that research is done, in that we allow peer review, and then anything that covers the threshold by its own peers gets published. And then we let the debate about what migration is or what migration isn't or what it should be take place as a process of selection. And obviously, articles that become classics don't become classic by accident. They become classics because they're selected and they have a resonance that carries over time, also in relation to the social world. So that's basically the ethos on which GEMS tries to work. Yeah, I'm sorry, my sound switched itself off then. I don't know why that happens, but hopefully I'm back. Another thing I wanted to point out was that GEMS has had a massive expansion. And this isn't like, some marketing ploy. This is really to do with the dynamism of the field. Because when I took over, one of the main things that irritated me was waiting for 3 years to get something published, or waiting for 4 years to get something published. So when I started, I said I wanted to get things out as quickly as possible. And that was just the beginning point and the standpoint. And we've tried to keep with that. Now, one of the downsides of that is that the numbers of articles coming through has really skyrocketed. But I think that also has to be due to, the massive dynamism of the field, that migration has gone to a certain extent being on the periphery of social debates to now being a core part of social scientific debates, where you have people from all other fields now picking up the issues. So there's now more and more coming through. So the number of submissions to GEMS over the last 5 years has gone from 300 to 1,000. And those 1,000 only account for 60% of our output, because 40% is special issues. So that gives you some sort of idea of the scale of things. Now, and this really interests me, because at the time I said I wanted to put things out quickly, the publisher said, oh no, don't do that because your impact factor will plummet. Well, what actually happened was that as GEMS doubled in output over the last 5 years, that the impact factor actually tripled. Now, we can all take impact factors with a pinch of salt. I don't think the most resonant are necessarily the most best, but we can't completely ignore that either. To give you an idea of the scale that GEMS now publishes, last year we published 20 issues, which was a massive 4,500 pages and 225 articles. So as I say, the idea is that we are, if you like, the heavy lifters. We want to simply, our idea is that the research only exists if it's in the public domain. So if research is above a certain standard, it should be in the public domain, and then debates can start taking place straight away, rather than publishing an article, waiting for 3 years, maybe the moment's gone, and then somebody reads it and responds after that. So that was always the basic idea and the ethos that brought into it when I started. And yeah, in some senses, I've also borne the consequences of that, because I sometimes don't know whether I run GEMS or GEMS runs me. It sometimes feels a bit like surfing a tsunami, or sometimes I have no idea what's going on. Though I obviously have to present it slightly differently publicly, which is probably better if this wasn't going on YouTube. But never mind. The other thing that we've also tried to do is use special issues as a way of opening up new fields, but also opening up to new scholars from new regions of the world who, basically, to stop it bluntly, being a European, North American debate about what matters. And that's actually been more successful than I hoped. It's been massively successful in relation to China. It's had some success in relation to Africa, though not as much as one would hope, but that's a work in progress, if you like. And the same with South America. So yeah, anyway, I'm going to wrap up there. I mean, basically, I'd also like to underline that we don't chase impact. I mean, for us, if an article is graded the best in its field by, you know, we're all academics, and sometimes it would be quicker to invite people round for dinner, given the number of people who read our work, than to actually publish it. And, you know, so we understand also the idea we select articles that are peer reviewed by people in that field. So even if they're niche topics, we're still interested in including them. So I'm going to stop there and yeah, hear from some of the colleagues on other journals. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So we'll move straight to Mimi Shallop.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. And thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be here. So, wow, Paul, after hearing the scale of GEMS, I feel like I'm like a boutique journal. I'm the co-editor of Mobilities, and we are not as massive as GEMS is, but I think are an important intersection with the field of migration studies from what we call the new mobilities paradigm or critical mobility studies perspective. So I co-founded the journal with John Urry and Kevin Hannum in 2006. We were all based at Lancaster University then, and we were just formulating this concept of the new mobilities paradigm. And it seemed at that time that the journal would be a great locus in which to sort of build an intellectual community around that emerging field of study. And since 2006, the field sort of took off and spread internationally, and the journal took off with it, kind of riding that wave in a way. It was at the time when we started it, Taylor and Francis, our publisher, told us it was one of their most successful journal launches ever. So we are now in our 16th volume, and we have increased our publication from I think it was initially 3 issues per year, and then 4, and then 5, and now we're at 6 issues per year, in which we usually include 2 special issues. And the special issues are proposed by guest editors, and they go through a slightly different kind of review process as a group. And some of our work on the intersection of mobilities with migration studies has been through special issues. So I'll just mention some of those. We had early on, volume 3, number 3 was a special issue called Migrant Worlds, Material Cultures, that brought in this idea of materiality and the aspects of the material cultural studies into the study of migration. Volume 6, number 3 was on mobilities and forced migration, and really trying to look at the ways in which theories of mobilities could enrich forced migration studies and vice versa. And what I want to underline in what's distinctive about our approach is that we call for papers that look at migration and diaspora framed in terms of wider mobilities theory. So we're looking for contributors who connect the study of migration, borders, et cetera, diaspora, with mobilities theory. And so that means that when we get contributions that we really see as more traditional to the field of migration studies, we usually do a desk reject of those. And let me say that we've had an increasing number of submissions as well. We used to get around, say something around 100 a year, 125, 130. It keeps creeping up, but it's nowhere near the thousands that Paul is talking about. So it's it's more like 150, of which we desk reject about 50%. Okay, because our pool of reviewers can only do so much reviewing, and so we're looking for articles that connect to mobilities theory and to our kinds of reviewers who will look at it in that light. So we, about 60 to 80 articles get reviewed each year. In addition to then the special issues, we publish about 75 articles per year, I believe. To go back to some of the other special issues, we had volume 8, number 1 on borders and mobilities, and volume 14, number 3 was called From Climate Migration to Anthropocene Mobilities. And so what you'll see there is guest editors who were taking the idea of climate migration as it's been circulating within, discussions of migration, and sort of arguing for this concept of Anthropocene mobilities as another way to theorize climate migration. Similarly, we have an upcoming special issue on, it's called Infrastructures of Injustice, Migration and Border Mobilities. So looking at this point where migration studies intersects with thinking about mobilities theory, different ways of conceptualizing mobilities, different ways of thinking about materiality, infrastructure, space, and the actual movement through space of people, things, and infrastructures as they cross the border. So it means that we're looking for that kind of special twist on migration studies, you could say. And I think that is where we have the problem with submissions that we interpret as really belonging more to a migration studies journal. And so I think that's the biggest message I want to communicate to this group, is sort of thinking about how your work speaks to this theorization of mobilities. And I just wanted to give one example. So this is our latest issue that I have my hands on from December 2020. And we have an article here called "The Migrancies of Maps, Complicating the Critical Cartography and Migration Nexus in Micro-Mobility Thinking." Okay, so micro-mobility thinking, there's that title. It's got this whole new concept. It's this new way of looking at maps. The author is Laura Lopresti. And what this article does is it looks at mapping as multi-expressive experiences and navigational performances of migration. And it critiques the immobility of maps, and looks at ways to complicate the relationship between maps and migration. And we consider this a really exciting kind of article, and it looks at different forms of mapping and has images, and that's the kind of stuff we're looking for. So I guess the only other thing, so just to step back, I wanted to just say that we have about 140,000 annual downloads of our articles. We joined the Social Science Citation Index in 2010, and our current impact factor, 5-year impact factor, is 2.386, which I'm pretty proud of for a small journal, comparatively small. And we're also very international in terms of our, our referees, our advisory board, and our contributors. And again, there's areas in which we would like to expand that even more, to reach wider communities. Yeah, I think I'll wrap up there and look forward to any questions.
Great, thank you, Mimi. And I think our audience can take it as an invitation, maybe to ask you questions about the scope and focus of the journal, because it's interesting to contrast the the quite purposive sort of agenda of mobilities in shaping a particular kind of field with the GEMS approach, which as Paul said, is a kind of we'll respond to anything and everything, as it were, that sees itself as migration. If it passes through the review process. So also I think we'll want to pick up a bit later also on the issue of the issue of the desk reject question is an interesting one, I think, how editors deal with this. So it's interesting you have a quite strong view on that. So yeah, Peter, do you want to introduce comparative migration studies for us?
Of course, thank you so much for the introduction, and happy and honored to be part of this group. Honored to be as a younger journal, to stand on the shoulder and the experiences of more experienced journals, and also quite excited that it's perhaps one of the first times ever that I don't represent the youngest journal. I think with migration politics, it's good to see somebody taking over that role and taking the field into new areas. So I have a brief presentation prepared. If I can read the French signs here correctly. Now, Adrian, if you can confirm that it's on the screen. Yeah, great. Then you see the presentation, or do you see?
It's quite small. It's quite small at the moment, but we've got.
Is this better?
Yeah, we're still seeing the side panels, but I think we get the idea.
Yeah, that's due to WebEx. I cannot.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I think go for it.
Yeah, good. So I'm here. The journal Comparative Migration Studies. I also do that on behalf of Professor Savitri Saharsa. So we are here as two editors-in-chief of the journal and also the two founders of Comparative Migration Studies. I'm not sure how long we can count as a young journal, but we were founded in 2013. And then really by a group of, you could say, young horses who said, well, there is a place in this rapidly expanding field of migration studies, as Mimi and Paul also signaled already. There's place for a new journal. There's place also for new themes in academic publishing landscape. And we, as young horses, we were a little bit stubborn, and we said, well, we try to go for ourselves, and let's see whether we can add something to the landscape. And our focus was always to set something for comparative research, bringing a variety of methods and discipline. But comparative research back then really had a clear purpose. We had the feeling that too much migration work really fitted into national models, often very national studies in national contexts. Also ethnic lensing, that was something that was also a concern to our group in the beginning. A lot of studies linked research immediately to ethnicity. And our group was very critical of that and saw being comparative as an approach to developing better migration theories and to taking the field further. And that was really the purpose from the beginning of the journal. So that's also why the label is comparative migration studies. Gradually, our scope has broadened. I sense the same, especially with Paul. I think we also went in that direction. Our scope became broader. The interpretation of comparative became broader, but we still have that sense for incredibly innovative topics. Then, as editorial board, we try to move everything in order to get new topics in our field, even if those new topics don't get referenced that much in the beginning. I remember that one of our first issues was on the role of ICT in migration and mobilities. And back then it didn't really spark a lot of, it was also hard to get it through the review procedure because it was so new that we could hardly find good reviewers for it. And but references took off after a couple of years. I think this was really the model that we want to signal as journal. I have to be honest, we became more mainstream now. I think as a journal, we are also pressured to achieve impact scoring, our ranking as a journal. And for that, you need to become a little bit more mainstreaming. But, and I'm very happy that Mimi and Paul said precisely the same, quality goes first. And that's the same with us. So we are really monitoring our quality procedure a lot and combining that with turnaround time of the journal. And we consider our turnaround time our biggest limitation of growth of the journal. So now we publish 6 issues a year, around 55 articles per year. And we keep it at that at the moment because we have the feeling that with our current capacity and also very little funding from the publisher, this is what we can do within a reasonable turnaround time. We've experienced that every time we were innovating and expanding, we experienced hiccups in our turnaround time. And we now feel that we have everything under control and we try to keep it like that. Then also an innovative thing is that we try, rather than only publishing articles and sending them into the world, we try to provide a platform for dialogue. Our commentary series, which really started as an experiment funded by MISCO, it really took off. A commentary series is sort of a special issue, you could say, with a lead article, and then we invite scholars, sometimes with an open call, sometimes upon invitation, to respond to that. And then you get a special issue with a dialogue between the articles in there. And that has been really, really well, successful at various levels. You could say at the level of referencing, they really have an impact, but successful primarily in terms of that this is the service that we try to provide to our field. This is something new that was not out there. It's also complicating our inclusion in all sorts of rankings because also SSCI don't know precisely what to do with it. So it brings a huge number of references, but yeah, does it fit into the traditional format? And there we are patient. We think it's important for our field, so we do it, and then the ranking comes later. Another important point is that we are connected to IMISCO, so we fulfill a sort of a community function within IMISCO also. I try to organize a dialogue within the community, but also beyond. And IMISCO also sent us on that mission. It's a journal sponsored by, associated with and sponsored by IMISCO, but it is not for only IMISCO. And if you look at our publications, I think it's about 50-50 at this point. We are, as Adrian already mentioned, we are an open access journal, and that's really a philosophy, but also an ideology of our journal. So we don't do anything that is not open access. If it cannot be open access, we don't publish it. Because we believe that our academic work should be disclosed publicly, broadly out there, without any thresholds imposed to the people reading it. And how many people go to journals through a VPN connection anymore? You want just to have easy access very quickly without VPN type of things through your library. That is the best way to make sure that your work actually gets read by the broadest possible audience. From ranking to reading, that's a little bit of phrase that our publisher always uses there. And so rather than focusing just on the ranking, focus on making sure that you get the readers for your article, so the references for your article. But I cannot say too much about that, but ranking will also come soon. And so we are already in this index where you're being watched as a journal, so we're like the waiting room to get that ranking. I'll come back to that later. Open access in most cases is for free for us because IMISCO has a sponsorship agreement with us. So if there's a connection with an IMISCO member institute, it's for free. But there are many other schemes that we can use because we are part of Springer Open support schemes for the Global South, a quite generous support scheme there, and a lot of deals with countries where if you are working in universities, recognized universities in those countries, which for most people is for many people is the case, then often without knowing it, you fall under a national deal where you can publish in open access for free. And for us as a journal, that is a lot of administration, but it's worth it because it needs to be open access in our case. So there's only a very small percentage that still needs to pay an open access fee with us. And our open access fee is also the lowest on the market because it's the condition for us to do this. So what we are trying to do is combining being also an open platform with a strong web-based presence, but also having still the characteristics of a traditional journal, being included in Scopus, Web of Science, also printing on demand, so that libraries also have actual copies of CMS. Yeah, then more briefly, just to put a little bit of evidence to the argument of open access, these are our growth numbers in terms of monthly downloads of our papers. And if you then look at 2020, we have 280,000 successful link downloads of papers. And I think this is really very strong proof that open access works. People want easy access to the articles, have a quick go at it, read it, and then see whether they can work with your material. And then if you invest a lot of time into writing the article, you want to make sure that people capture it. And so we are incredibly proud of these figures. 280,000 it's really more than we could ever have hoped for. Yeah, there are a couple of very successful publications here also on African migration from Flahaut and Daas, for instance. But it's quite diverse. If you look at these high impact publications that we have had, I'm happy to say that they don't come from one discipline nor from one method. That's also very important. Also for me as editor, it's one of the biggest worries. Can I find reviewers for all the methods? And I think by now we are rather successful in that, in making sure that we provide a good publishing space for multiple methods. Yeah, and the last thing, if you look at Google Scholar Citation Index, I'm not sure what your universities work with. I'm very proud that my university has recently abandoned the system where the points that you get for your position are connected to the impact ranking of the publications. But instead of that, and that's not so good, my university is now looking at Google Scholar. And if you look at Google Scholar here, migration studies, we are now in 12th position. But if you look at the H5 median, then we are already above that a little bit. But it shows that we are a young journal there, but we found our place in this expanding publication market so far. Okay, let me just conclude by thanking you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please raise them. And if you have questions after the round table, don't feel any invitation to contact us through our website, or to contact me or Savitri Sahaso, the other editor, personally. Yeah, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, I hope that's an invitation we can extend for everyone. You know, a chance obviously to meet the editors and follow up if you wish. We'll move to Saskia Bonjour now of migration politics. I forgot to mention that Saskia is also giving a talk for NCCR, I believe, in May the 6th with Sarah Lutz of Bristol University. So looking forward to that talk coming up soon. So Saskia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think in the introductory remarks, the journals represented here were referred to as top journals, major journals, and important journals, which is more praise than I was dared hope for, since migration politics has not published anything yet, like nothing. We're that new. We founded Migration Politics last year. That is Darshan Vigneshwaran, Evelyn Ersanili, and me. We all work in political science at the University of Amsterdam. The journal Migration Politics, it aims to publish work on the representation, controlling, and managing of migration. So that's certainly not limited to political science perspectives. To the contrary, we hope for interdisciplinary perspectives that also involve geographers and anthropologists and sociologists and lawyers and historians. Some of the angles that we're interested in, certainly not an exhaustive list, is like GEMS, I think, to expand the study of migration politics beyond Europe and North America, to look at the role of migrant agency in migration politics, to bridge or build dialogues between study of colonialism, study of race, and migration studies, gender and queer perspectives also on migration studies, and reflections on the role of migration scholars in migration politics. Now, everything I said so far, I think, is more a matter of where we put the emphasis, but where we're really trying something very new is in the mode of publishing, on what it means to be a journal. So we have 3 principles. The first is slow scholarship. The second is not for profit. So we're not working with a commercial publisher. We work with Sidepost. I can talk about that if you'd like. We're also aiming to be fully open access without charge to the authors. So that second and third point, the not-for-profit and still fully open access without charge for authors, I can answer questions about that if you'd like to know how we achieved that small miracle, or how we hope to achieve it. But I want to talk a little bit more now about the slow scholarship bit. So for now, as we start off, we're not aiming for high volume. We're not aiming for impact factor anytime in the foreseeable future. We are not accepting unsolicited manuscript. Instead, we are sending out calls once or twice a year for authors to share their idea with us. So a concept for a paper, not a full paper, but a concept for a paper. And then among those paper proposals, we select a certain number. We hope to be able to do 6 a year that will come spend 2 weeks with us in Amsterdam on an author's residency. And then we work with the authors to make that paper the fantastic paper that we think it can be. And then after that, when the paper is ready, it is submitted to Migration Politics. And then the Amsterdam team is kind of cut off from the process. We have an editorial college that you can see on the website, who is in the editorial college, and they take charge of the review process and of inviting external reviews and of taking the editorial decisions. So we had our first call this year. We have 6. We have a virtual, unfortunately, a virtual residency now coming up in April, and then another one in October. Fingers crossed that that will be in person, but might have to be virtual as well. And so we hope to publish our first articles sometime in 2022, I think. We're also working on a policy to do something like special issues that would still fit in our slow scholarship philosophy, but would exist besides the residencies. So it's a completely new thing that we're trying out. It's I have to say, if it wasn't for Darshan and Evelyn, I don't think I would ever have dared to take this leap. I'm not a revolutionary thinker, I find. But Darshan and Evelyn, or maybe as a team, apparently we are. And I'm very excited about this. It's been a tremendous joy working on it so far.
Great. Well, this is really fascinating because we've had actually a series of presentations that give us a complete variety of modes of operation of journals. And while everyone's thinking up of questions, and the questions can be, I think, very practical ones, but also you might want to engage in the broader issues here that are being presented about the nature of the field and its evolution. So I think is represented partly by the development of the journals, as we've heard going through them. I mean, what's obviously interesting, listening to Saskia is there's a certain sort of excitement, I think, around around new generation of work in migration studies. I tend to think of it, perhaps a bit crudely, but with the sort of label of critical migration studies, which is coming from places both in disciplinary and theoretical terms that is really quite distinctive and different from the migration studies that people like myself and Paul grew up on in some sense. There was a very distinctive sort of framework for international migration studies, actually very much influenced by America, and we've not heard much really about. I mean, that would be one topic, I think, is the kind of shift of emphasis here towards topics that are not towards a field that's no longer dominated in a sense by American scholarship, and particularly by the things that would be published in International Migration Review, International Migration, and to some extent ethnic and racial studies, which I think also could be factored into our discussions a little bit. The relationship between our field as presented and ethnic and racial studies as a kind of field, which is interesting. There are overlaps. I do think that the mobilities and critical mobility studies that Mimi's presenting also overlaps substantially with the kind of field that Saskia is sketching out, partly because there's a lot of geographers involved and anthropologists and a certain kind of sociologists, as opposed to different sorts of sociology, political science, and economics, and so on that might be in other places. I thought also another theme that's really fascinating is, of course, the relationship of the journals to corporate ownership and corporate pressures. So we've got two journals that are run by Taylor and Francis, big machine type journals, and two journals here that are trying to break with that to some extent. Springer, is a different kind of model. The open access model is a very big challenge, I think, and it'd be interesting to know what our participants think about this. The relative pros and cons of going with the unusually structured new journals versus the solidity of going with one of these big corporate machines that gives you all of the kind of infrastructure, as it were, for publication in terms of ranking and accessibility that comes with the big journals. And to what extent I don't know, that the bigger journals are also concerned about access would be a good question, I think, particularly with the ambition of being global. As we heard, I mean, if it costs libraries fortunes to buy into packages for mainstream journals, not everybody can get access to journals. Yeah, I think the final kind of area where I'd love to hear more, but I'd invite questions maybe first before anybody responds to me, is to hear a bit more about the pros and cons of the desk reject type of model. I mean, I as a writer and somebody who reviews a lot for journals, I'm very, very frustrated as a reviewer when I get papers that I think should have been desk rejected. But at the same time, journal editors are under a lot of pressure to show procedures that effectively take them out of the equation in terms of their personal influence, perhaps, on making decisions. So we have a range of positions here, from kind of traditional peer review procedures all the way through to this new model, the slow scholarship model of migration politics that's very challenging in terms of putting back into play the role of the editors as really shaping the content and field, as opposed to reflecting the scientific consensus that's out there through peer review. Interesting to know how much all of you have been involved, I guess, in shaping what the journals publish through your vision as editors, or through the visions of your editorial boards and so on, in kind of creating particular kinds of journals. So Robin, are you there? Because you might need to help a little bit. I'm not familiar with the system in terms of taking questions and so on. I mean, it'd be nice to see people. I mean, if people are willing to come on visually, and
yeah, exactly.
Nice,
I will
like to open the floor really for further questions. They can either be general questions, or you can ask a particular editor a question. We'll try and sort of shape the discussion as we go along.
Exactly. I will let the options of asking the question in the chat, or just activate your video and ask your questions directly. Yeah, you can go ahead.
So we have a question.
Yes, I have a question from Lorenzo, my dear colleague
of On the Move. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, Lorenzo, do you want to join in? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Good to see you.
Thanks, everyone. I hope, can you hear me? I am having problems with the connection. It was a fantastic roundtable, so thanks, everyone. Mine is a very practical question. It strikes me that most of the journals are still concentrated in few countries. I think, if I'm not wrong, for example, the journals in this roundtable are based in the Netherlands and the UK and the US. Actually, the Netherlands and the UK only. So I was wondering if you monitor the kind of people who publish in your journals in terms of gender, for example, but also in terms of the countries where they are based, because as we know, at least I suspect there is still a certain concentration from what we call the global north, as you also mentioned in your presentations. And if so, I would be curious to know if there have been changes recently. That is, of course, what I hope. But I don't know if you have any data on that. Thanks again.
Yeah. So I think we should just try and get responses from the editors. Also you might, if you want to jump in on any of the points I raised or other things that you've heard from other journal editors that you want to highlight. But I just ask, try and keep your responses fairly brief so that we can keep a nice dynamic here. But that's obviously a very important question that Lorenzo's posing.
I can jump in.
Yeah, go in.
Just to say, I mean, one advantage of a large publisher like Taylor and Francis is that they give us extensive statistical data back in an annual publishing report each year. I don't have a current one right in front of me, so sorry, I can't speak to the exact details, but the breakdown they give us is by country, right? So we have a very wide geographical range, and we can see both the countries of authors who are submitting articles, but also where the journal is being downloaded and read. We get a breakdown not only by country, but by specific universities. And so that data is very robust. We do not get a breakdown by gender. And so I could not tell you that. And we don't internally review that ourselves, except in the sense that we try as editors to expand the call for papers and for contributions as widely as possible, and to sort of bring a gender lens to that. But we don't keep, I don't believe the publisher keeps data on that for us.
Peter, yeah, just to...
Yeah, okay. To echo a few points of Mimi and to add on that. So one, in terms of gender, we also don't have data on that. It's not that difficult to collect the data, but it's not there, it's not produced. In our group, in the editorial board, the advisory board, also the editors of chief, we have structurally embedded gender diversity and diverse backgrounds, other diverse backgrounds. My fellow editor-in-chief is also has a background in critical gender studies, so it has been there from the very beginning in the journal. If you look at publications, then migration studies in general, in terms of gender, we are moving in the good direction. That's also reflected if I then quickly look at my shortlist here of most referenced articles that I just showed. The first three involve a female lead author, so we are good there. The second thing is very important to us, but harder to achieve. That's the globalization of the journal. And it has been difficult, I think, on all journals, also because the globalization of migration studies has not been a very easy development. We are making rapid steps there. And we are trying to make the move towards, as a journal, also to rather to follow, to lead that road. So to have a globalized board, advisory board, as well as a globalized editorial board for CMS. So that structural instrument is in place. But again, let me be very modest there. It is just very hard. And I think one of the other editors, Paul, also mentioned that it's very hard to get sufficient good articles, for instance, from Africa and South America. And we are looking very hard for that and encouraging input, working with the African Migration Network, for instance, but it is very hard. But anything that the journal can do to enhance that, we are trying, and we want to try. It's a journal, you could say it comes from the Netherlands, but if you look at the publication structure, then it's very hard to pin down journals in certain countries. The publishers are global, the editorial boards are very important then to look at. And I think if you look at all our journals, we have globalized editorial boards or editorial colleges.
So there is this, general critique that's out there now about decolonizing migration studies, and this is obviously going to impact a lot, I think, the field and thereby the journals and the agendas that are being pursued. I wonder. Obviously, this and part of that agenda is explicitly about the underrepresentation of authors from different parts of the world. So yeah, I'm sure Paul and Saskia would like. Saskia maybe first, and then Paul can round up. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for the question. I think it's a very important one. Like I said, we haven't published anything yet, so there's little statistics. But we did find that out of the 70, I think, people who applied for our first authors in residency program, there were fewer submissions than we had hoped that were not from the global north, and then many, certainly not all, but a relatively large proportion of the submissions from the global south, we had the impression were originally drafted in a contracted research situation, so not in fundamental, like not people who are paid to do fundamental research, but people who have to find contracts to do research, and then you get different orientations, right, and different priorities. So I think that's at least part of the issue, but I also think that as a journal, we can really do a lot of work, the kind of work that Peter was just referring to get better access to the networks, and probably also we have to earn the trust, right, of people a little bit first before they submit their work with us, perhaps, especially if you're in a precarious employment situation. One of the things that we have several people in our editorial college who bridge language divides. And that's an interesting thing, I find. So we're really thinking very hard about how, as an English language journal, we want to remain English language, what we might do. Like we're playing with ideas. It's really all very, I don't know if this is an easy position for me to be in. We're like, oh, we have all these ideas and nothing to show for it yet. But we've been playing with this idea of having a written roundtable where different people reflect, different scholars reflect on the differences and the connections between, for instance, Francophone and Anglophone, or Spanish language and English language, or maybe Chinese language and English language literature on migration, right? And to kind of inform the English language audience about what the debates are and what the concepts are and what people think the differences and the possible connections might be. So these kinds of ideas is what we're playing with or thinking about.
And Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, we've worked really hard to be inclusive towards other countries, and in some cases that's meant using personal contacts, and particularly, as you know, at Sussex, I mean, global studies and a lot of people do work on development, and so we've really used those networks. But you know, the idea that there isn't scholarship out there in some of these countries isn't really true. I mean, my own career has taken a direction towards Thailand, and there is very good research out there, and sometimes, you know, we've had internal discussions about, do we want the nth article on Muslims in Europe, or do we actually want to you know, hear an article about internal migration within Thailand, which has been one of the massive things that drove economic development there, and has all kind of interesting things for gender and radical transformation of society and all that kind of thing. That's before you even get onto the international side of it. But you know, and you know, a few years ago, I mean, I think actually you were in Guangzhou at the same time, because you sent me a message, Adrian. I remember you were always everywhere. But you know, so we actually had a special issue that was qualitative work in China by Chinese scholars, whereas before all the papers we received were these econometric ones. But you know, that actually hosting that event, which wasn't, for political reasons, even wasn't allowed to be held in the university, it had to be held in a hotel. So you know, we do make a lot of efforts, but I think I think, you know, we also have to remain intelligent people as academics, even if we believe and support and promote diversity, because there's also, there's also increasingly the idea that numbers can be used relatively easy to give an explanation to what's going on in society, and that they give an answer that at the background it's always discrimination. And first of all, there has to be realism about what editors can actually do and can't do. The selection of which papers should be published or not. Yes, we can maybe shape some of the topics, and also think a little bit about maybe lowering the bar for people and topics from certain regions that we think should be in. We can do those kind of things, but I think there also has to be an understanding of the limitations of what can be done. I mean, for example, data protection would mean that I can't even publish a thank you to reviewers now because of data protection rules in Europe, right? So the idea that I can publish information about how people self-perceive their gender identity, or how they perceive their ethnic background, which we all know as scholars is very problematic in terms of categorization, which always puts people in different ways, is not as easy as one would, as sometimes it's presented. So I think that I'm all in favour in moving forward, but I think it's a debate that needs to be led by a critical insight, but also some realism, rather than it simply being a kind of crude numbers game, as the way it's sometimes presented on Twitter or that kind of thing.
Right. So I'd like to be sure, with our audience out there, we've got a lot of people listening in, that we want to capture some questions, I think, about publishing, about the issue of the work that you're doing and the journals that you are interested in publishing. So do think of this as an opportunity to talk to the editors really about at least generally about issues you have with the processes of journal publishing and difficulties you've experienced. As I said, I heard quite a few grumbles earlier, and I think we have a question from Nick and then Lisa coming up. So hi, Nick.
Hi, thanks everyone for the very interesting talks. It's really interesting to see the different philosophies and kind of intentions and aims of these journals. I'm going to go with kind of a practical question, or more of a reflection. Turnaround time is obviously a very important thing for researchers and academics, especially early career researchers who are trying to establish themselves and also build their CVs. But also, so as an early career researcher myself, this is a big issue, but I also have been working with Paul with GEMS as an editorial assistant. So I see the other side, and I know how difficult it is for editors to find reviewers, to get reviewers to submit on time. And I know that the process can often take quite a long time. So I'm just wondering, I guess, how to navigate this. Do journals, as publishers, do you take any consideration into academic or early career researchers? Is there any kind of way to be a bit more supportive? Or is this just a difficulty with kind of the industry and how things work, and that's just something we have to deal with? And then also specifically to Saskia about the newer Migration Politics Journal, it's really quite interesting, and the slow scholarship is quite appealing. Again, I think for early career researchers where there's a bit more of a structured and intensive feedback, that can be, I think, quite useful. But then again, it comes back to this kind of competing goal of like getting publications out and getting things processed. And so is this journal aimed at early career researchers? Is it open to everyone? And like, yeah, what's the thought process on that, I guess?
Why don't you answer Saskia first, and then we can see if any of the others wanted to pick up the more general point.
Yes, thank you. So On the turnaround for early career researchers, that's one that I have to, that's just, I think, a very good one to raise in our next editorial college, like whether anyone has smart ideas about that. Other than that, the SciPosts, so the platform that we work with, because they were originally in physics. And in physics, it's completely normal to already put your work online as you submit. And so we're also working with SOC Archive and encouraging our authors to put their work online as soon as they submit it. And actually the peer review process is also open. So everyone can read the reviews and read your responses, and everybody can actually, you can invite people to contribute to the review process if you want. So I think that helps in the sense that people can at least read your work and you can claim it as yours, independent of the length of the peer review.
Yeah.
With regard to your second question, so no, actually, I think when Evelyn and Dashan and I invented this, we were thinking like, oh, how lovely would it be? Like, it's how we would want, like, how we would to, like, have this spa for authors, right? Like, that was our dream. So it was intended for ourselves. So, and we're all like associate professor, you know, like that tenured people. But the most people who responded to this goal were early researchers. Surprised at that also in the sense that we thought that you would kind of need a secure position to be able to take the risk, right? Of, you know, like take the leap with us. But apparently early career researchers are like, nope, this is it. This is what I want to do. This is who I want to be part of. So we were actually very happy about that. But so we ourselves have no idea, no specific plan. We are working a little bit strategically on getting some senior scholars to publish with us, just to, you know, like to establish the reputation. Yeah. I guess we still have to play the game, right? Yeah. Yeah, we're very excited also about the work of the PhD and postdoc researchers who are working with us now.
Thanks.
I could say a couple things. Just that, so one thing is that we when we invite our reviewers, we remind them to be kind, considerate, constructive, and not to like just tear down what somebody submits, you know, in particular when we are aware it's early career researchers. So we have a quite lengthy kind of tips about that to all of our reviewers. And I was going to say that there's a number of ways in which early career scholars can sort of get into the pipeline in a way that's very helpful. And so in the field of mobilities research, there's a number of mobilities research networks around the world. And this relates to the global scope of the journal as well. There's a sort of strong, robust Latin American kind of mobilities research group. There's an Australian and New Zealand, 2 different groups, and there's a new Asian mobilities research network, as well as the Cosmobilities network. And so within those networks, there's a lot of conversation, exchange, workshops, conferences, and that often helps kind of lead towards a publication that's very specifically tailored to the mobilities kind of field. And in particular, I recommend going through these special issues, which is if you've done a conference paper and you're involved in a panel and there's an idea for a special issue there, that's a really great way to get it sort of shepherded through with guest editors doing an initial round of conversation and revision with you before it goes out to the anonymous reviewers of the journal. And I think that's like my top tip there.
Yep, Paul, briefly, and then we'll bring in Lisa, maybe.
Okay, yeah, hi Nick. Yeah, I think this is quite an important question. I had a long discussion actually with Roger Waldinger about it some years ago, because we were trying to find a mechanism for putting early career researchers into the journal in a kind of more instrumental way. Now the upside of, so it was actually having a special section, and we talked about it. Now the upside of it is that, yeah, that would work in some ways. The downside of it, though, was that talking to some early researchers, they said, well, we don't want our articles to be seen as second grade articles. So we don't want that categorization. So it was a difficult thing to deal with in a way. And so, yeah, I echo the words about networks and support, but I think there's also a lot of things that authors, not just early career researchers, can do, which is that when you think you have an article that's ready to go, leave it for a couple of weeks, get somebody who's in the field and you know to read it, to give you feedback, and then have another go. Because it goes a little bit to what Adrian was talking about with desk rejects. I mean, the important thing is to get over the threshold to get into the review process. So the extra 5% or whatever can be important to get you over that threshold. I haven't come up with a system for making it easier for earlier career researchers, and I would be open to advice on how we could do that. As I say, it's something I looked into instrumentally, but I couldn't find a way of doing it without, in a sense, making it look downgraded as well. And in the end, it was a collective decision. The discussion went in the direction that wouldn't really be what we wanted to do, because then there's also young researchers like yourself who's published this year who are then in the mainstream gens and it's just your name and nobody knows who you are. Yeah. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to solve.
So can we, unless Peter has something to add, we can maybe bring Lisa in, and maybe Peter can take the next comment if you like.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
If it's a general question, anyway. Yeah.
Yes, I think I have two general questions which came up somehow in our discussion beforehand. Like a very, very practical question. So when in doubt, if the journal fits, for example, we discussed, is it okay to kind of contact you as editors and ask, since, I mean, I guess you get a lot of requests, and as Paul said, there's a lot of work going into this, and you have other things to do as well. So what happens, for example, when in doubt, are you actually fine with getting a quick thing, like, hey, this is the abstract, do you really think it fits, because I'm super unsure? And I think the second question would be, what happens, for example, if English is not your native language and you do not have the money to already kind of go through professional proofreading 5 times? How open are you in that sense? And then the third really quick question would be, if you want to experience like being an editor in the journals, like besides becoming a reviewer, after you have done some kind of publication yourself and you would be interested in doing the editing stuff yourself, what are the options here for young scholars? Thank you.
So yeah, Peter, any of the above really, or anything else you want to kind of reflect on?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa and Nick. These are very relevant questions. I think it's very nice that if you are publishing and you are trying to move beyond that, it's very nice to, when you're asked to be a reviewer, to also be a reviewer yourself. You learn a lot from looking at articles through reviewers' eyes, and you also learn how to look at your own work through reviewers' eyes. That's very important. And it's not just our journal. I see it also in the other journals. An increasing part of advisory and editorial boards are younger scholars, early career academics. So it's not so problematic. You don't need to be a super senior in order to get into an editorial board. That's also not how most journals approach an editorial board. Editorial board should be representative, cover different fields, cover different methods, and should allow the journal, and that's the link to also to Nick's question, it should allow the journal to have efficient turnaround times. You need knowledge in your editorial and advisory board in order to be efficient in turnaround time. There, I also want to be very modest, because if there's one thing that we always talk about in our editorial board, and it keeps coming back, is turnaround time. And then when you think you have fixed it and solved it, then you haven't, and then it comes back. It's incredibly hard to find sufficient reviewers for all the articles that are being submitted. Also incredibly hard to invest sufficient time ourselves in helping the reviewers, reminding them, bringing reviews together. Also incredibly hard to mitigate things that happen last minute. Somebody says yes, and then after 50 days you don't hear anything, and you send a personal message and said, oh, did I click that button? I don't remember. And then then I have to do something. And it's also it's not the case that we have like 6 or 7 reviewers lining up for every single article. So I think this is just to summarize, that is just the hardest part of the work behind the scenes for journals. And I know of mobilities and GEMS that you're doing very well, and I think that's a good achievement. If you're a big journal and you have okay turnaround times, that must cost an incredible amount of work. CMS is only 6 issues a year, and for us this is 60% of our agenda. How to limit turnaround time within 3 months between submission and first decision. What we aim for is 3 months. We don't always make it, but if we don't make it, you get a notification that we don't make it. And unfortunately, we do need to send that every now and then. And perhaps the last thing from Lisa's question is whether you can ask questions to editors. Yes, I think it's part of this preparatory process. Before you submit your article, you want to make sure that there's a fit and that's good quality. And part of that is asking the editors whether this is indeed a fit for the journal. So yes, please do that. And we respond to that, and I think most journals are inclined to respond to those questions. So be careful before you submit, because when you submit, you've lost it you lose the article for at least 3 months before you have the feedback. So you have to be sure that you don't lose those 3 months.
I thought it might be worth a couple of points just to systematize some of the tips that are emerging here in terms of publishing in journals. I mean, one thing I think we ought to be noting is the fact that when you're in the midst of a PhD, or you're still working on that big project, I think it's important not to publish too soon. I mean, I think it's really important to take your time with your first big publications, and waiting may actually be worth it in terms of getting that publication. That involves participating in the kinds of networks that Mimi is talking about, EMISCO or other conferences, graduate conferences, and sharing your work widely with your cohort, and with as many readers who are willing to give you kind of feedback along the way. And I thought Paul's advice about the kind of last minute sort of waiting and getting it read again and getting a bit more feedback is also likely to be a very important one, because I think we've all had that experience of perhaps wanting to publish something too quickly and realizing maybe could have done with a bit more development to avoid what becomes an inevitably very, very painful process when you get into these very difficult revise and resubmits situations with extremely, difficult, if not impossible, requests from reviewers, multiple reviewers sometimes, to improve the work before it gets up. And you get, as Peter's saying, you lose a lot of time then. You've lost the article once you've sent it, and maybe you could have waited and had more success with a little bit more patience. Saskia, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard from colleagues who are also editors that they really appreciate cover letters with the first submission, and that's actually something that I, as an author, have never done so far. And I was just wondering whether you find that useful. So the idea then is that the author writes a specific letter to the editors explaining why they think this article is interesting and fits into the journal. I always thought that's the abstract and the introduction. So why do you need an extra letter? But apparently there are editors who really like to have the letter. So
yeah, Paul's shaking his head, I think. So what does Jem say about this?
Yeah, I really don't have time to look at that. Like you say, I mean, it's the abstract and the intro, and then looking about whether it's good enough to go out. I'd love to have time to do all those kind of things. I'd like to write a little intro to each issue of GEMS, but that's just never going to happen. It's hard enough to get through it as it is. I'd just like to pick up on one of the questions that hasn't been answered, which was an important one, which is about native English language use, because the barometer the rule that we have is that the language has to be sufficiently good to be comprehensible and make the argument, but it doesn't have to be polished. So that people in the academic world, many have lived in and worked in different language environments, including myself, including probably most of you, and understand what that's, that can be challenging. So as long as the message comes across, we're okay with that. If it's at a level where you can't understand what's going on, obviously that's a judgment call, but one tries to be supportive in that respect, which I think is an important thing. And anybody wishing to volunteer to be a reviewer is very welcome to get in touch, and you'll be receiving quite a lot of articles from us fairly soon. It can be good experience as well. I also should say that the quality of reviews that we get, I mean, I read some of them, and I'm the constructive way that people review, I would say for 95%, and the detail they go in is really, is really admirable. And when you think that people are doing that in a global pandemic and all the chaos that's happening, it's been a very difficult year, the last 12 months for journals. I'm sure everybody will echo that in getting things done. But it's the dedication of reviewers who do it for nothing is really quite extraordinary, and that does really need saying.
Well, it's good to know that the whole system isn't collapsing, because that's what I've been wondering, whether review would collapse. But yeah, it's good advice. I mean, getting involved at an early stage in review is really important. Mimi, you wanted to?
Yeah, I wanted to, I mean, I echo what everybody already said, but I want to also answer the question about becoming an editor, right? Because you asked about that as well. And I want to point out, I think it's really important to recognize there's two different kinds of editorial roles. And sometimes younger scholars get involved in what's called being a managing editor, which is actually a lot of work that's involved, sorry, excuse me. A lot of work that's involved in the sort of correspondence with authors and the back scene work of the journal. To be the editor of the journal or co-editor involves knowing extensive academic networks who you can call on to identify referees. And that's a really important thing that's not always visible, is like there's this knowledge base that we look for if we're looking for a new co-editor or someone to join as an editor, that do they know globally, internationally, many people in the field, because that's what you need to bring to the role of it being a good editor, is identifying who those reviewers are going to be for every article that might be submitted. And so usually that's someone who's at a somewhat more advanced career stage. I'll just add that.
I don't know, we're kind of moving towards our conclusion now. I don't know if Robin
yes,
Robin or Lorenzo wants to come in on behalf of the program, and
I would like to take my privilege as an organizer to raise a question, and controversial point, actually, a bit, that one that has nurtured some of our discussions in the previous sessions. It's about the impact factors and the rankings. And here you seem to have different views on that. Paul and Mimi, maybe you seem to give importance to that aspect, if I understand you correctly. And Peter, you seem to have other ways of ranking, the Google Scholar ranking, and Saskia, you seem to reject that altogether. And yeah, I would like to have your view on that, and why should that matter also for early career researchers, and why should that not matter? Actually,
can I just jump on the back of that? I think there's another issue here which we haven't raised, which is the relationship of publishing in these interdisciplinary journals versus publishing in the big disciplinary journals, and how do the editors view this? We're all of us are also involved in particular disciplines, and many of us have experienced a sense of our work not being properly valued because it doesn't sit very comfortably in a particular discipline. So this is a really difficult piece of advice that we always have to give to young researchers. So, and that's wrapped up, I think, in the ranking question as well, which is often a disciplinary ranking.
I mean, I can jump in there first just to say that Mobilities was created as an interdisciplinary journal, and it was partly John Urry's inspirational critique of disciplines, right, of disciplinary boundaries. When I moved back to the United States, I found that disciplines are much more important in the US academic system, despite people giving some acknowledgement to interdisciplinary work. When it comes to tenure review, they look to see if you've published in the top discipline journals with the impact factor. And so Americans are like very uptight about that. In Europe, I think it's a much more open interdisciplinary system of journals and fields and publishing, and it's not. And then there's a huge shakeup happening, right, in the academic world and the publishing world in terms of open access, in terms of equity issues. And so there's a transformative push happening. And I'm really glad to hear about Saskia's model there, which is incredible, but just even more open access, even in the sort of major publishing houses. Even Taylor and Francis is looking at pushing towards more open access models under pressure from publics and from governments, honestly. So I think there's a lot of change coming, but the impact factor is still a holdover from like the old days.
Paul, and these are maybe wrap up comments, I guess, to some extent.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, impact factor in a sense has been the bane of my life in relation to running the journal, because we completely ignored the idea of impact factor when we took over the journal. Instead, we just run it in a way that academics want, which is to get their research out quickly and get it in the public domain, and then let the academic world do with it what it wants. When the impact factor, as I said, the impact factor tripled when we doubled in quantity, which is counterintuitive. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's been problematic. When it went above 2, I thought, well, that's, it can't go any higher, and now it's at 3.113. But what does all that mean? It doesn't personally mean a great deal to me. I know which articles I think are good and which ones I think are less good, just as any other academic can make those judgments, and those judgments do not directly correlate with the ones that are most resonant, which in recent years have been on topics of refugees and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's also the other problem with getting a high impact factor is that then you get lots of people from across and outside of the disciplines that are normally within, which is already a very broad field of migration studies, suddenly piling in and with another round of submissions as well. So there's also the worry that success and the fact that institutionally impact factor is pushed can actually take us away from being what we originally wanted to be, which was an academic community-driven journal in a sense for the migration community. And yeah, I think that my own view is that migration is a field, not a discipline, and that it shouldn't be reified as such. And I think that one of the reasons it's been so dynamic and creative is by that, is by interdisciplinarity, as well as, sort of comparison being built into things, as well as a transnational element, which brings, sort of a global dimension into things as well. So, yeah, whether disciplinary or interdisciplinary journals, I've always had a very difficult, never really been able to place myself in those kind of discussions, and so I tend to step back and let it happen, really. But impact factor isn't everything, and I think that, I mean, to be fair, even to Taylor and Francis, for some reason they've taken a stand back from impact factor, and now they call it a basket of indicators, which basically all say the same thing anyway. But it's I don't know, but I don't think we should be driven too much by that, and maybe it does have too much importance in the way these things are driven, which has more to do with ref and evaluation and those kind of things.
Yeah. So Saskia, yeah.
Yes, so for me, the impact factor and the probable lack of it for the foreseeable future, given that we don't aim for high volume, right? So with low volume, achieving indexation and impact factor is very unlikely. So for me, that's especially, I think, especially for people who don't have tenure yet, that might just make it impossible. You know, because you have to be strategic and you have to make choices that the people who might hire you or who might grant you a fellowship or will appreciate. And so that's really something. Yeah, that's one of the things. When I said I'm not a revolutionary thinker, that's one of the things where I was really like, oh, is that gonna work? And where I'm still a bit, oh, is it gonna work? But the fact that so many people seemed eager to publish with us, even so, makes me more confident that maybe people have more than one paper and they can afford to place at least part of their papers with us. Or, I mean, what we hope for, obviously, is that the quality of the paper is going to make it very well read, and that is in the end what matters, and that is how impact is one of the ways in which you can assess impact, and also who reads it and what do they do with it, right? So I don't, yeah. For me, some of my papers have been published in super high impact journals, but nobody reads them. And so, and whereas, I mean, other papers were published in less high impact journals, and they don't count for as much for whether I get to be professor someday, right? But I mean, they're read, and that's really nice to be read. It's really nice. So, yeah, but it's a struggle, like Paul, it's a struggle.
We should hear from Peter, maybe, to
Yes,
round
thank
off
you.
this last round.
Much has been said, and let me echo what Saskia just said. I have the same. Some of the publications I'm most proud of and get most reference, they were not in the top journals. So that doesn't say everything. Now, on the first point, disciplines versus field journals, that really depends on what you want to achieve with your article. So do you want to make a contribution to the interdisciplinary field of migration studies? Then go for a migration studies journal. Do you want to make a contribution to mainstream political science or sociology? Then choose that journal. I'm also in between both worlds, policy sciences, political science, and migration studies. And with every article, I make a different choice depending on what I want to achieve with that article. It really depends on the content of it. Yeah, and the second point, agree on everything that has been said. We as a journal also very critical of the whole idea of rankings, impact scores, actually established out of a sort of a young horse, stubborn attitude towards it even. Very important also is that the impact scores say something about average scores of a journal. They don't say how many people will actually read your article. So that is this transition from ranking to referencing or ranking to reading. What really matters to you in the end is how many people will actually read and refer and work with your work. But there is realism to that. I mean, here we are all a little bit revolutionary and trying to part with the old model. But the realism is that for many people in 10 years and before, this is important. And whether you get points even, until last year, even at my own university, that was the case. So I think with CMS, if I would try to conclude this, I think we try to combine the best of both worlds. We try, yes, to get that ranking and proper scoring. And as you saw in Google Scholar, that's going quite well. But no, we don't put everything at stake for that. I don't think any journal here at the table has chosen the ranking itself as an objective. Nobody in publication landscape does that. Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you. I guess we have to close. So I hope the audience will let Robin and the other organisers know what they think of our discussion. I hope that it has been enlightening and interesting. And just to thank very much all of our colleagues here who've taken time out to join us and talk to us about their journals and inspire us with their suggestions about publishing in the field. So.
Thank you all. Thanks, Adrian. And just quick comment in the chat. The joy of being an editor is getting to read so much new upcoming work all the time. It's inspiring and great work that you guys are all doing.
Thanks very much to all of you, to the speakers and the participants. It was really a great pleasure. I just seized the opportunity to advertise the next conference by Saskia, Bonjour, and Sarah Coons on the 6th of May on the hierarchical relationship between migration and mobility, which will be fascinating. 6th of May at the NCCR on the Move. Thank you very much and have a good evening.